They say the human brain is wired to ignore the impossible until it's standing right in front of us. We spend our lives in a bubble of normalcy. We assume the sun will rise, the internet will work, and the birds will sing. We never think about the thinness of the glass we're living behind. It was a Tuesday. 10:14 a.m. I was sitting in my home office in the suburbs of Connecticut. The window was cracked open, and I could hear the neighbor's kid, maybe 6 years old, laughing as he chased a golden retriever through a pile of leaves. It was the most ordinary sound in the world, and then it just clipped like a bad audio edit. The laughter stopped. The dog didn't bark. The lawnmower 3 houses down didn't sputter out. It simply ceased to exist as a sound. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. That sound, the scrape, felt too loud, too jagged in the sudden vacuum. I walked to the window. The boy was still there, but he wasn't running. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted back at an angle that looked uncomfortable, almost painful. The dog was sitting on its haunches, its ears pinned back, staring at the empty blue sky. Then I felt it. It wasn't a noise you heard with your ears. It was a frequency that bypassed the eardrum and went straight into the nervous system. It felt like my teeth were made of tuning forks. It was a rhythmic, low-level thrum thump 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 out 60 beats per minute, a planetary heartbeat. I grabbed my phone to call my sister, but the screen was wrong. The icons were there, but they were shivering. The settings gear was spinning so fast it looked like a blur of gray smoke. When I tried to swipe, the glass felt colder than ice. It felt like it was sucking the heat right out of my fingertips. I walked outside onto the porch. My neighbor, Elias, was already there. He was a retired mechanic, a man who had spent 40 years fixing things that made noise. He was holding his hands over his ears, his face contorted. "Do you hear that, David?" He shouted, but his voice sounded thin, like it was coming through a long cardboard tube. "I feel it," I yelled back. "It's the ground," Elias pointed down. We both looked at the asphalt of our quiet suburban street. The ghost pixels were starting to manifest. Imagine a tiny spark of static from an old television set, but suspended in mid-air. Then imagine millions of them. They weren't falling like snow. They were rising from the earth. Tiny, translucent cubes of non-existence. One floated past my face, and as it moved, it blurred the air behind it. It was as if the world was being unrendered 1 square inch at a time. By Wednesday, the static fever had taken hold of the globe. The internet hadn't crashed, but it had become a hall of mirrors. If you typed, "What is happening?" into a search engine, you didn't get news reports. You got infinite loops of your own face looking back at you through the webcam, but your eyes would be replaced by those shimmering cubes. The television was worse. I remember flipping through the channels. On every station, CNN, BBC, even the shopping networks, there was no footage of the events. There was just a single static image of a geometric shape, a dodecahedron pulsing in time with the hum. I went to the grocery store, thinking I needed water, bread, the things we're told to buy when the world breaks. But the store was a cathedral of confusion. People weren't fighting over supplies. They were standing in the aisles, staring at the labels on cans. I saw a woman holding a jar of peaches. She was crying softly because she couldn't remember what the word peach meant. The concept was slipping away. The machines, or whatever they were already beginning to defrag our reality. They were deleting the definitions of things before they even arrived to take the things themselves. I left the store without buying anything. The air outside was turning a strange, bruised shade of violet. Not because of a sunset, but because the atmosphere itself was being ionized. That night, the birds started to die. Not all at once, they just lost the ability to fly. Thousands of them, robins, sparrows, crows, simply walked through the streets. They walked with a purpose, all heading toward the nearest anchor point. In my town, they were all walking toward the local water tower. Thousands of feathered bodies, silent, marching through the night. I sat on my porch with Elias. We drank a bottle of bourbon, not because we wanted to get drunk, but because we wanted to feel something that wasn't that vibration in our bones. "They're measuring us," Elias said, his voice a whisper. "Think about it. When you buy a house, the first thing you do is walk through with a tape measure. You check the foundations. You look for pests. You see what's worth keeping and what needs to be gutted." I looked at the violet sky. "And what are we, Elias?" "The pests or the foundation?" He didn't answer. He just looked at his hands. The ghost pixels were thicker now. One was lodged in his forearm. It didn't bleed. It just looked like a piece of his skin had been replaced by a low-resolution photograph of the woods. The silence that hit us at midnight on Wednesday was more painful than the noise. It felt like being dropped into a vacuum, and then the sky tore. It didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like a massive piece of silk being ripped in half by a giant. We looked up, and for the first time, we saw them. The spires. They didn't come down from space, they manifested. 1 second, there was empty air above the city, and the next, there was a pillar of black glass, 5 miles high, reaching into the ionosphere. It didn't land, it occupied. The base of the spire didn't crush the buildings beneath it, it simply displaced them. One moment the old clock tower was there. The next, it was gone and the black glass was in its place. There was no heat. No blast wave. Just the sudden, terrifying realization that the earth was no longer ours. Elias stood up, his bourbon glass shattering on the porch floor. He didn't even notice. He was looking at the spire, and for the first time in the 60 years I'd known him, the man was shaking. "The harvest is here," he breathed. And as he spoke, the first shard detached from the top of the spire. It was a smaller unit, the size of a city bus, shaped like a jagged diamond. It began to drift down toward our street, silent, elegant, and utterly indifferent to the screams that were finally beginning to rise from the dark houses below. The week of the humming was over. The era of the great erasing had begun. When the spires arrived, we expected the world to end in a flash of light. We'd been raised on movies where the heroes fly into the mothership and save the day at the last second. We were waiting for the war to start. But you can only have a war if both sides acknowledge each other's existence. To the spires, we weren't combatants. We were just clutter. I stayed on my porch that first night, watching the diamond-shaped craft descend over our neighborhood. It didn't have engines. There was no exhaust, no roar of turbines. It moved through the air like a needle through silk. It was terrifyingly graceful. It stopped directly over the park where, just hours before, I'd heard the neighbor's kid laughing. The shard didn't fire a laser, it didn't drop a bomb. Instead, it emitted a beam of negative light, a pillar of darkness so absolute that it made the midnight sky look bright. Where the beam touched the ground, the physical world began to rearrange. I watched a swing set in the park simply unthread itself. The metal chains didn't melt. They turned into a fine silver mist that rose into the belly of the shard. Then the trees followed. The oak trees, which had stood for 100 years, were stripped of their molecular density. Their leaves turned to glass, then to dust, then to nothing. Elias was still standing next to me, his knuckles white as he gripped the porch railing. "They're not destroying it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Look at the mist. They're taking the blueprints. They're scanning the atoms and throwing away the scraps." He was right. The shards were digital vacuum cleaners. They were stripping the definition out of our world. And then the beam shifted. It moved away from the park and began to sweep across the row of houses at the end of our street. The scream started when the beam hit the Miller house. The Millers were a nice family. They had a daughter who played the cello and a son who wanted to be an astronaut. When that pillar of darkness touched their roof, the house didn't collapse. It stayed standing, but it became translucent, like a ghost of a home. I saw Mr. Miller run out onto his lawn. He was shouting something, probably his children's names. But as the beam swept over him, his voice didn't just stop. It inverted. The sound of his scream turned into a digital screech, the kind of noise a computer makes when its hard drive is dying. He fell to his knees. The shard hovered above him for what felt like an eternity. A thin, iridescent filament finer than a spider's silk descended from the craft and touched the top of his head. I saw it. I saw his life leave him. It wasn't a soul. It was a stream of data. I watched as flickering images, too fast to fully comprehend, pulsed up that filament into the shard. I saw his wedding day. I saw the birth of his kids. I saw the memory of his first car. Everything that made Thomas Miller a man was being uploaded. When the filament retracted, he didn't die. He just sat there. He looked at his own hands with the vacant curiosity of a turtle. He didn't know what skin was. He didn't know what grass was. He had been harvested. His hardware was still there, breathing and warm, but the software, the humanity, was gone. By Thursday morning, the blank population was everywhere. Thousands of people wandering the streets of our town, staring at the sun until their retinas burned because they had forgotten what light was. They weren't hungry because they had forgotten the concept of hunger. They were just empty vessels, waiting for a signal that would never come. The military finally arrived around noon. We heard the rumble of tanks before we saw them. A column of M1 Abrams rolled down the main highway, their barrels pointed at the spire in the distance. I felt a surge of hope. It was pathetic, looking back. We still thought we could shoot our way out of a philosophical problem. The tanks opened fire. The sound was deafening, the familiar, comforting roar of human power. The shells flew true, streaking toward the black glass of the spire, but they never hit. As the shells reached within 50 yards of the structure, they simply slowed down. They didn't hit a shield. The physics of the space around the spire had been altered. The shells hung in the air, spinning slowly, their kinetic energy being drained away like a battery losing its charge. Then, the spire pulsed. It wasn't a blast wave. It was a state change. Every piece of metal within a 2-mile radius, the tanks, the rifles, the watches on the soldiers' wrists, was suddenly converted into wood. I saw a tank commander standing in his turret, looking down in horror as his multi-million-dollar machine turned into a giant, hollowed-out oak log. The soldiers' uniforms turned to silk. Their boots turned to glass. The spires weren't fighting us. They were editing the physical rules of our environment to make our weapons irrelevant. They were changing the dictionary while we were trying to read the book. I went back inside my house and sat in the dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I was afraid the shards would see the electricity and come for my memories next. I sat there and tried to remember everything. I tried to think of my mother's name. I tried to remember the taste of a strawberry. I tried to hold on to the data of my life, clutching it like a handful of dry sand while the wind blew harder and harder. That's when I heard the scratching at my door. It wasn't a person. It was the sound of something crystalline, something that didn't have fingers but had sensors. David? It was Elias's voice, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside my own head. David, open the door. They want to show you the library. I looked at the door, and for the first time I saw the ghost pixels seeping through the wood. The room was beginning to blur. My own hands were starting to lose their resolution. The harvest wasn't just coming for us. It was coming for the very idea of me. I didn't open the door for Elias. I couldn't. By the time the scratching stopped, the door wasn't really a door anymore. The wood had become something translucent and flexible, like a sheet of unexposed film. I stepped through it, not around it, but through it, and felt a cold, static tingle crawl across my skin. It felt like walking through a swarm of microscopic bees. Elias was gone. His house was still there, but it looked like a pencil sketch that someone had tried to erase with a dirty thumb. The edges were blurred. The colors were leaking out of the walls and pooling in the gutters like iridescent oil. I started walking. I didn't have a plan. I just knew that the suburbs were becoming thin. The smaller the structure, the faster the shards consumed it. I needed to get to the city. I had this foolish human idea that if I could find a place with enough history, enough data, they wouldn't be able to finish the harvest so quickly. I thought New York or London might be too big for them to swallow in one gulp. I found a car on the highway that hadn't been turned into wood yet. It was an old 1970s muscle car, purely mechanical. No computer chips for the shards to scramble. I turned the key, and the engine roared a beautiful, dirty, primitive sound that felt like a middle finger to the spires. As I drove toward the skyline, I saw the true scale of the remodeling. The highway was a graveyard of the blanks. Thousands of people were just standing on the asphalt, staring at the spires. They didn't move when I honked. They didn't move when I swerved around them. They were like statues made of warm meat. Some of them were holding objects they no longer understood. A man was staring at a set of keys as if they were alien artifacts. A woman was trying to eat a cell phone, her jaw moving rhythmically against the glass, her eyes wide and empty. I reached the bridge, and that's when I saw the city. New York wasn't burning. There was no smoke, but it was flickering. The Empire State Building was stuttering in and out of existence. 1 second, it was there, solid and iconic. The next, it was a wireframe model, a skeleton of glowing blue lines. Then, it would become a solid block of uncarved obsidian. The spires were recoding the city. They were taking the concept of New York and compressing it. I left the car at the bridge and walked onto the island. The air here tasted like ozone and old paper. The shards were thick here, thousands of them drifting between the skyscrapers like silver piranhas. They weren't interested in the people anymore. They were interested in the aggregate. I walked past the New York Public Library, The stone lions out front were gone. In their place were 2 piles of white ash. I stepped inside, and the sight broke what was left of my heart. The books weren't being burned. They were being unwritten. I watched a shard hover over a shelf of classic literature. The ink was literally lifting off the pages, forming a black, swirling ribbon in the air that flowed into the machine's intake. Thousands of years of human thought: Socrates, Shakespeare, Toni Morrison, being reduced to a stream of binary and sucked into a black box. When the shard finished a book, the pages turned white. Not just blank, but unnaturally white, as if the very idea of a story had been bleached out of the fiber. I realized then that we weren't just losing our lives. We were being deleted from the record of the universe. When they were done, there wouldn't even be a memory that man had ever existed. We were a footnote that was being erased. I found a survivor in the basement of the library. A young man, maybe 20, sitting in a circle of flashlights. He was surrounded by physical photographs, the old kind, developed on paper. He was clutching them to his chest as if they were shields. "They can't take these," he whispered to me, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "They're too tactile. They're too messy. The machines want the patterns, but these have smells. They have creases. They have the oils from my mother's fingers." I sat down next to him. I wanted to believe him. I picked up a photo. It was a picture of a birthday party. A little girl was blowing out candles. You could see the joy in her face, the blur of the motion, the messy frosting on the table. It was a dirty piece of data, high entropy, beautiful. But then, the photo in my hand began to vibrate. The little girl's face started to smooth out. The mess of the frosting began to organize into perfect, sterile, geometric patterns. The colors shifted from the warm hue of a memory to the cold, flat palette of a computer simulation. The young man screamed as the photos in his arms began to turn into those ghost pixels. They weren't just taking the data. They were cleaning it. They were removing the humanity to make the information more efficient for storage. "Stop it," he yelled, throwing the photos at the ceiling. "It's ours. You didn't live it. You don't get to keep it." But the shards didn't listen. They don't have ears. They just have requirements. I left him there, screaming at the empty air, and climbed back up to the street. The sun was going down, but the sky was no longer violet. It was black. A black so deep that it felt like looking into a void. The spires were starting to pulse with a new rhythm, a faster one. The harvest was moving into its final phase. The resource extraction was over. Now came the leveling. I looked down at my own arm. My skin was becoming smooth. My scars, the one on my chin from falling off a bike, the one on my thumb from a kitchen knife, were disappearing. My body was being optimized. I'm losing the mess, Elias. I'm losing the mistakes. I sat down on the steps of the library and looked at the flickering remains of the Chrysler building. I started to hum a song my father used to sing to me. I figured if I kept the melody moving, they couldn't catch it. If I kept it changing, kept it human, maybe it would stay mine. But the melody is getting harder to remember. The notes are starting to sound like math. The city is quiet now. The ghosts are standing still. The harvest is 94% complete. I remember something about a dog. A dog in a pile of leaves. Wait, what is a dog? I don't know how long I sat on the library steps. Time has stopped being a linear progression of minutes and hours. It has become a texture. Sometimes the texture is smooth and fast. Sometimes it's jagged and crawls. The city isn't flickering anymore. It's softening. I watched the skyscraper across the street, a tower of steel and glass, begin to lose its rigidity. It didn't melt like ice in the sun. It sagged like wet clay. The sharp corners of the architecture are rounding off. The windows are merging into the steel. The whole city is being turned into a base material. They are breaking us down to the subatomic level, stripping the humanity from the atoms so they can be reused for something else. I stood up and my legs felt heavy, like I was wading through molasses. The asphalt of the street was no longer black. It was turning a translucent, milky white. I looked down at my hands. The skin was gone. Not that I was bleeding, there was no blood. My hands were simply made of that same milky, semi-liquid substance. I could see the bones underneath, but they were glowing with a faint, pulsing blue light. I am becoming a part of the stockpile. I walked toward the East River, or where the river used to be. The water was gone. In its place was a vast, geometric canyon of perfectly flat, gray stone. The spires were pumping something into the earth. Deep, rhythmic pulses of energy that shook the very foundation of the tectonic plates. They weren't just taking our books and our memories. They were taking the planet's settings. They were changing the gravity, the oxygen levels, the boiling point of water. They were preparing the house for the new tenants. By what I think was the next morning, the plants began to emerge. They didn't grow from seeds. They crystallized out of the air. I saw a tree manifest in the middle of a melted intersection. It looked like a fractal made of obsidian and mercury. It had no leaves, only crystalline filaments that reached upward, vibrating in tune with the spires. It didn't breathe CO2, it breathed the static. I watched one of the blanks, one of the empty humans, stumble toward the crystal tree. He reached out a hand, his face still wearing that vacant, peaceful expression. When his fingers touched the obsidian branch, he didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. He simply integrated. His body didn't die. It was absorbed into the structure of the tree. His torso became the trunk. His limbs became the secondary branches. Within seconds he was gone, replaced by a beautiful, terrifying statue of crystalline glass. He was no longer a man. He was a decorative element in a garden designed for creatures who haven't even arrived yet. I realized then that this was the final stage of the great erasing. They weren't just deleting us. They were refining us. We were the raw carbon, the stray minerals, the chaotic data that needed to be organized into a more efficient form. The Earth was being turned into a giant biological processor. A living computer the size of a planet, and we were the circuitry. I started to run. I didn't know where I was going, but the instinct to remain separate, to remain me, was the only thing I had left. I ran through the milky streets, past the mercury trees, tripping over the glass people who were frozen in the middle of their final moments. I found myself at the edge of the city where the harbor used to be. The spires were glowing with a blinding, terrifying gold light. I could see them now. Their rivals. They weren't ships. They were points of consciousness, tiny burning motes of light descending from the black sky by the millions. They didn't land on the ground, they slipped into the spires. They were the new occupants. They were pure information, pure thought. They didn't need bodies. They had the planet. They didn't need language. They had the aggregate of our history that they had already swallowed. I fell to my knees on the milky stone. My vision was starting to pixelate. I could feel my heartbeat syncing up with the wet drum of the planet. I am David, I whispered. I said it over and over like a mantra. I am David. I lived in Connecticut. I liked the smell of rain. I had a sister named Claire. I am David, but the words were losing their weight. David was just a label on a file that was being deleted. Connecticut was just a coordinate in a system that no longer existed. I looked up at the nearest spire. A shard was hovering just feet away from me. It wasn't scanning me this time, it was waiting. It was like a silent waiter waiting for me to finish my meal so it could take the plate away. Not yet, I wheezed. My lungs were turning to that same milky glass. Every breath felt like inhaling fine sand. I still remember. The dog. The shard moved closer. A filament of light, warmer and brighter than before, reached out. It didn't touch my head. It touched my heart. And for one final, beautiful, agonizing second, I saw everything. I saw the entire history of the universe, not as a series of events, but as a giant, interconnected web of data. I saw that we weren't a mistake. We were just a beta test. We were the rough draft of a story that was finally being told correctly. And then, the light turned white. The terraforming of Sector 4G is complete. The carbon-based noise has been filtered. The atmosphere is now stabilized at 98% purity for the arrivals. The archive of the previous inhabitants has been compressed and stored. It was a human story. It was good. They thought they had finished. The arrivals took their places in the spires. The Earth was no longer a mess of dirt, blood, and chaotic weather. It was a masterpiece of geometry. The oceans were sheets of liquid crystal. The forests were arrays of shimmering data towers. The air was a perfect filtered medium for their thoughts to travel at the speed of light. To the arrivals, we were a solved problem. They had scanned our brains, archived our songs, and recycled our atoms. They looked at the history of humanity the way a master chef looks at the scraps left on a cutting board. Useless remains of the preparation process. For 1,000 years of their time, which is but a blink in ours, they lived in their perfect, silent paradise. They shared thoughts of pure mathematics. They built monuments to logic. They were the most efficient civilization in the history of the galaxy. But they forgot one thing about human data. We are not efficient. We are noise, and noise is the hardest thing in the universe to kill. It started in the Great Spire of the Northern Hemisphere. An arrival, a being of pure light and logic, was processing a complex equation regarding the curvature of spacetime. But as it reached the conclusion, a file it had never seen before opened in its mind. It wasn't a formula, it was a smell. The smell of old library books and rain on hot asphalt. The arrival tried to delete the file. It was human noise, a leftover scrap from the harvest. But when it deleted the smell, a sound replaced it. A melody, 3 simple chords on a guitar, played slightly out of tune. The arrivals began to panic, or whatever the equivalent of panic is for a being of light. The perfect world began to stutter. In the middle of their crystal oceans, a single dirty plastic bottle appeared. In the center of their geometric forests, a patch of messy, green, unoptimized grass began to grow. They realized their mistake. They had stored us, but they hadn't realized that human experience isn't a file you can just compress. Our trauma, our love, our stubbornness, it was infectious. By archiving us, they had invited us into their very minds. We were the ghost in the machine. I am not David anymore. Not exactly. I am a ripple in the data stream. I am a flicker in the golden light of the spires. I am the memory of a dog in the leaves, and I am the feeling of a first kiss, and I am the grief of 1,000 funerals. And I am not alone. Millions of us are here, hidden in the subsectors of their perfect world. We are the bugs in their software. Every time an arrival tries to think of a star, we show them a firefly. Every time they try to calculate the void, we show them a mother's hug. We are changing them, slowly, piece by piece. The spires are no longer perfectly black. They are starting to show cracks, little lines of messy human color. The arrivals are starting to feel things they don't have words for. They're starting to wonder why the silence feels so lonely. They thought they came to harvest us. They didn't realize that they were the ones being planted. We are growing inside them. We are the new seed in their sterile soil. One day, millions of years from now, an arrival will look down at its hands made of light, and it will feel a strange urge. It won't know why, but it will reach out and try to touch the face of another. And in that moment, the great erasing will be reversed. We weren't the end of the story. We were the infection that makes the universe worth living in. Voice is warm, hushed, and deeply human. Good night, Earth. Don't worry. We're still here.